The beginning of the 20th century saw a very unstable political climate across the globe. Great powers Spain and the Ottomans were on the brink of collapse, and their influence was taken over by the rise of new world powers such as Japan, the United States, and Germany. This was a time in history when the strength of the nation was defined by the navy. The Great White Fleet and the victory over Spain showed the world that there was a new power competing with the old. And Japan, a nation secluded from Europe and Western civilization, wins a stunning victory against Russia in 1905, being one of the most humiliating defeats for a global power. The late 19th and early 20th century saw a rise in new ideology, rise of mass media, and increasing tensions between global powers in a shrinking world. There is much debate over the nature of the relationship between Germany and Britain in the years before the war. Historians look towards newspapers, written speeches, and memoirs to help answer this. There also exists another discussion over what caused this declining relationship between the two nations. There are three major factors that are highlighted in the causes of the antagonism. The first is international conflicts, such as the Boer War or the Russo-Japanese War led to increased tensions. The second is the influence of media on decisions made by the government entities. The last is the rise of nationalism and patriotism in the Western world. While not all historians agree that the arms race was not directly linked to the start of World War I, it did have a direct impact on the shaping of alliances that led to the massive scale of the war. Other factors led to the war itself, as well as having direct connections to the arms buildup. To understand the relationship between the Anglo-German arms race and World War I, you must understand the origin of the race itself. In fact, the genesis was in the fast-growing nation of Germany, and it's specifically related to one man, Alfred von Tirpitz. Tirpitz commanded the German Navy during World War I, but served in high-ranking positions in the Navy years before the war. Tirpitz learned about the importance of a strong navy while studying the geopolitics of East Asia when he led a German squadron through the Pacific. One article from 1897 summarizes Germany's acquisitions of East Asian lands. The Fremdenblatt then says that Germany's expedition to China, like her colonial conquests in Africa, is not favorably regarded by the English press. Whereas the English have long been accustomed to competing with the French and Russians in distant parts of the world, Germany is a new rival. In the spring of 1896, Rear Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz left Germany to East Asia to find a promising location for a potential German colony. Tirpitz stopped in the United States on his journey and admired the nation for its fast development and nationalism. Tirpitz came across a German community in America stating it bounded any remaining loyalties to the German nation. Tirpitz admired Japan as well for their fast development despite being an Eastern nation, but most importantly, Tirpitz observed how strong navies allowed the Russians, British, and French to hold so much influence in such as distant land. Historians have long debated the nature of these two nations' relationship. Some argue that an antagonism didn't exist until the war began, and others support the idea that it was quite possible for the two to become allies. Despite these claims, much evidence exists that there was a decline in their diplomacy. Churchill publicly denounced Germany during the Morocco crisis of 1911, and tensions rose during the Samoan succession. An article published as far back as 1882 by the London Times stated, ostensibly directing it darts against the political Anglophobia and the military madness of the Cologne Gazette. Many articles containing the same anti-German and anti-British rhetoric were published in the few decades before, the war often revealing paranoia towards the build-up of the German fleet in the Anglo world. German press was more influenced by the government than the British press was, which could support the idea that the Kaiserreich had a role to play in the Anglophobia present in their media. The first major scene of conflict between the two powers arose from the Boer War. Many Germans were upset about the treatment of the Boers, who are a Germanic people, who share a common culture and identity with the people of Germany. The Pacific theatre became a source of tension between Britain and Germany as well. Not only were German acquisition of colonies in China increasing tension with Britain, but the death of King Malietoa in Samoa led to an overlapping claim between Germany and the United States. Germany found their influence outmatched by joint cooperation of American and British forces and was only able to claim the eastern half of the islands. The British supported the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War that severely affected Germany's influence in East Asia. Wilhelm also tried to secure a naval base in North Africa during the Morocco crisis. This deteriorated Germany's relationship with Britain and France. Media and propaganda often othered the people of both nations. Historians debate the reasoning behind this, but experts often focus on factors such as how much the media represented public opinion and how much influence that state had on media. One news article from 1904 states, "Nevertheless, the situation existing between England and Germany is not regarded as alarming, for Count von Billow is known to be too able a diplomatist and too expert a manipulator of newspaper opinion not to change at one stroke the bearing of German representatives and of the German press if he were really apprehensive of trouble." Historian Lothar Reinemann believes that the media's true motivation for the creation of these narratives stems from the fact that newspapers sell better when they contain nationalistic rhetoric. Reinemann also states, Wilhelm became a representative individual whose personal characteristics were generalized to the entire German population. The British press truly created a sense of isolation between Germany and the other world powers. There were periods of time when the media had a friendlier attitude between the British and Germans, but the relationship was tattered for the most part. The magazine Simplicissimus released numerous political cartoons that covered the importance of a German navy and the geopolitics of Europe. Cartoons such as English Concentration Camp depicted the British treatment of the Boers. Another influential piece of propaganda was William Le Queux's 1906 book Invasion of 1910, which was a fictional novel about a German invasion of eastern England in 1910 and drove fear into the British public regarding the strength of the German navy and
It is
army.
too foolish, too fantastic to be thought of in the 20th century. Or is it fire and murder leaping out of the darkness at our throats, torpedoes ripping the bellies of half-awakened ships, a sunrise on a vanished naval supremacy, and an island well-guarded hitherto, at last defenseless?
International issues and conflicts such as the Morocco crisis, the Samoan succession, and the Russo-Japanese War still had a major role in the influence of the naval arms race and the decline of the Anglo-German relationship. But none of them would have occurred the way they did if it were not for German colonial and naval expansion. Tirpitz frequently stated that for Germany to have the same kind of influence as other world powers, it would rely on a powerful fleet. Militarism has been identified in the Wilhelm period of Germany, which stemmed from events such as Bismarck's reunification of Germany, or the Franco-Prussian War, and carried into the 20th century. But nationalism in Germany had just as much of an effect on the construction of a German fleet, if not more so. While nationalism has many aspects of ethnocentrism, it also had an effect of pulling public favor to support decisions made by the state. Tirpitz even admired other nations for nationalism when describing his perception of Native Americans in his trip through the United States. There is something tragic and grandiose about the fact that the population of a big continent became extinct over a period of about 150 years. Through Tirpitz's perspective, Germany was a growing power through its military and industry, but many Germans operated their economic ventures under the flags of other nations. With German control of overseas colonies, it gave German people the opportunity to achieve the same success under the German flag. Events like the Boer War also spurred the onset of nationalism in Germany. While the British had an ethnocentric perspective towards their colonial subjects, but in fact the English and Germans share a more cultural kinship than with most other European nations. Still, British pride relied more on their navy as being a large part of their identity, especially when the dreadnought was invented in Britain itself. This occurred in a time in history when the public often supported a strong military to help defend against potential adversaries. One benefit of patriotism for the state was that it helps unite the nation behind foreign issues while ignoring any domestic issues. This was intensified by the fact that Britain was experiencing economic decline and Germany's naval inferiority that scared the populace enough to support the state. Even during the Boer War, the German public demanded the Kaiserreich to denounce the actions of the British. When the state remained silent on issue, it had low public approval, but when the attack of the Boers was acknowledged by the state, it was praised by the German press. Wilhelm was often attacked by the British press for his decisions, and it was reflected on the German people. While the press was certainly influenced by the state, it remained autonomous for the most part. While not all agree that the naval arms race was a direct cause of the war, it certainly influenced external events that pushed nations deeper into conflict. Tirpitz supported the expansion of the German fleet because 1. It would benefit the country through maritime trade, and 2. A strong navy will give Germany more negotiating power. Germany had the army and geographical location to prove tough adversaries for France and Russia, but without a German navy, the island nation of Britain was safe, unless Germany had a navy that could compete with the British. Germany would have no chance of establishing colonies in East Asia if it was not for the navy. But it was Germany's search for potential security partners was what caused the shape the alliances in the war. Germany had the Ottomans and Austria-Hungary as allies during the First World War, but it did make attempts to acquire other partners such as the United States, Russia, and France in the years preceding the war. Germany lost their chance to gain the United States as an ally due to competition in the Pacific. Germany contested the ownership of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. When the German squadron arrived at the islands, they were met by British and American forces. The British also helped the Americans by allowing them to refuel in Hong Kong, and even though Tirpitz recognized the United States as a valuable ally after the Samoan succession, there was no hope for the Germans and Americans to form a partnership. Tirpitz was also hoping that if Germany supported neutrality during the Russo-Japanese War, not only could they gain favor from the French and Russians, but establish more influence in East Asia. But this did not come into fruition as the Japanese won against the Russians using British ships. Germany also lost the opportunity to gain France as an ally due to the Morocco crisis. Germany's attempt to gain a foothold in North Africa was questioned by the Spanish and French. But when the Germans arrived in Tangier to contest its fidelity to France, the British supported the French, which caused the French and German relation to deteriorate. Germany had few options left for allies. Austria-Hungary was somewhat of an obvious choice due to the cultural connection the two nations have. Italy joined this Germanic alliance in hopes to gain more territory in North Africa, but decided to side with the French to secure Austrian land near the Eastern Alps. With this loss, Germany's best option was the Ottomans, who were known as the sick man of Europe. Germany needed the Ottomans to be able to blockade Russian ports in the Black Sea. Britain didn't have the same opportunity to seek out Russia as an ally the same way they did with France. But France and Russia were allies, and if Britain wanted France as a security partner, then they had to seek out rapprochement with Russia. All three nations were open to this partnership to help maintain the peace in East Asia. Even though the British supported Japan against Russia during their war, they feared a Russo-German alliance based on the fact that Nicholas II helped his cousin Wilhelm secure a German port in China.
There had been only a few months ago a widespread impression that the German emperor had the ear of the Tsar, and that in Russian military circles at court there was a feeling anything but friendly towards England. In well-informed quarters here, however, that feeling, so far as it actually did exist, was attributed rather to the fear inspired by Germany after the Russian disasters in the Far East than to any real desire to establish closer relations between St. Petersburg and Berlin or to any incipient Anglophobia.
These diplomatic alliances not only deeply benefited Britain, but it was their main motivation in the naval arms race. Britain's wasn't necessarily worried about the German Navy surpassing their own. In fact, at the beginning of the war, the Royal Navy was almost double that of Germany, and Britain did hold somewhat of a qualitative advantage as well. What Britain and her people truly feared was being outmatched by the Germans in the North Sea, while much of their navy was defending the rest of the empire. It was important for Britain to secure allies to be able to defend their colonial possessions. Once Britain gained important allies, they could move large parts of their fleet back to home waters to defend the island. Germany no longer was dealing with the British in the Pacific, but now faced the Japanese. Meanwhile, Britain had to protect its Mediterranean possessions against Austria, Hungary, and Italy, who was eventually replaced by the Ottomans. But when Britain secured France as an ally, they could rely on the French and Russian fleets to help defend the Mediterranean theatre. By the time the war had started, Britain had secured their overseas empire through diplomacy and could have a fleet strong enough to pose a serious threat at any German attempts to lead an invasion onto the island. While the naval arms race was costly for both empires, it encouraged Britain to seek out alliances in a historically tense period of time. In 1910, a dreadnought cost around $8.7 million, which would inflate to around $357 million. In 1909, a proposal in Britain would provide the empire with 60 dreadnoughts. In today's US currency, that's around $20 billion and $700 million in yearly maintenance. Military budgets were seeing all-time highs by 1901, which is seen in this chart. When inflated to the modern US dollar, Britain was spending $16 billion the same year that Germany was paying $7 billion for their military. Even losing one dreadnought would be a devastating loss, so Britain and Germany normally used less expensive ships like the British-designed cruisers or the German U-boat, which had devastating effects on Allied shipping. The most famous naval engagement during World War I was the Battle of Jutland. Both sides claimed victory as Germany inflicted more than double the number of casualties as the British inflicted, and Germany sunk 3 ships while only losing 2. But it was still the Germans who retreated from the battle. Even though there is no clear winner following the battle, Britain was able to have a stronger blockade on Germany's ports, and Germany increased its U-boat campaign.